सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Republic Day, we've all watched the parade, felt very proud, but you know what? So many of us, or at least some of us, remain fixated on politics. And in this case, it is not domestic politics as in party politics, but global politics, global strategic situation and how India belongs there, where India is positioned, and how India has a worldview at various points of time as it evolves. We are doing it in an innovative way. We are doing this by looking at the list and succession of chief guests on India's Republic Day. So first of all, let me give you the broad figures. India has had 72 guests so far on 4 years. Nobody was invited, right? Which includes 2 years of the pandemic, where for 1 year Boris Johnson was invited but had to cancel because of the pandemic. So 2 of those years and 2 earlier. So for 4 years, there was no guest, otherwise 72 guests. And when we say 72, remember, one of those is counted twice. That is Jacques Chirac of France. He came first as Prime Minister and then came as President. Thereby lies a tale, and I will come to that. And thereby lies a tale of great strategic, geostrategic importance for us in India, and we might have missed that story. So that's why sometimes you find answers to complex riddles by looking at simple things like the list of guests at your Republic Day. So of the 72 guests, look at the countries which have the top score. So UK has 5, and once again there is a story there. UK 5, Bhutan 4, neighbor, USSR, Russia. So we are counting them as 1, 4. Nepal twice, United States 1, that was Obama under Prime Minister Modi. But there are some unusual guests also. So among the unusual guests, there are 2 from Pakistan on our Republic Day. And if I told you that one of those 2 was our chief guest on the Republic Day of 1965, you can't even blame Nehru for that, because then Lal Bahadur Shastri was the Prime Minister of India and we had a Pakistani chief guest. I will tell you about him. We had a Pakistani chief guest. Within months, we were fighting a full-scale war. So 1965, Pakistan's Food and Agriculture Minister Rana Abdul Hamid was the chief guest. And as you know, within 3 months, we were fighting a mini war in the Rann of Kutch, and a few months after that, we were fighting a full-fledged war on our western frontiers with Pakistan. So they've been unusual guests. But if you look at this list of guests, it tells us a very interesting story, a fascinating story of the various phases through which India's worldview has evolved in these 75 years. So let's say the first phase was the post-colonial idealistic phase. That's when India was coming out of colonialism, and that's the reason we had so many UK chief guests at that point of time. And those UK chief guests, in fact, the first chief guest from UK wasn't even a head of state. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer, R.A. Butler. So he came in from UK in 1956. That year, we also had Chief Justice of Japan, that is Kotaro Tanaka. 4 of the 5 chief guests in UK actually were invited in the first, say, 14 years since the formation of the Republic. So there was 1956, Chancellor of the Exchequer, then 1959, Duke of Edinburgh, 1961, Queen Elizabeth herself, 1964, Lord Mountbatten. After that, there was almost a 3-decade gap until John Major was invited in 1993. By mid-60s, India was over with its post-colonial phase. The important thing is, what was India's post-colonial phase was also India's phase of global idealism. That's when India thought that they can fix many problems in the world. Or Nehru thought that was the Nehruvian worldview. And that's why this kind of pacifism, that we had 2 guests from Pakistan and one from China in that period. So I told you 1965, months before a war started, while Pakistanis were planning the war, we had Pakistan's Food and Agriculture Minister Rana Abdul Hamid come into India as chief guest on Republic Day. 10 years before that, 1955, Pakistan's Governor General Ghulam Muhammad had come in as our chief guest. So that was the idealistic phase. In 1958, in that phase, we had the Chinese military chief. That was the Chinese Marshal Ye Jianying, who was the head of the Chinese Armed Forces, head of the PLA. He was the chief guest taking salute on our Republic Day, 1958, right? By that time, tension on the border had already started. So that was the post-colonial / idealistic phase when India thought that India was already a Vishwaguru. Nehru's India thought, Nehruvian worldview was that India was already a Vishwaguru and the world will listen to us and we should reach out to the world. So that phase ended, I would say, generally after the 65 war. What came after that? What came after that was the Cold War phase. India became a Cold Warrior. Although India remained a non-aligned country, but heavily inclined towards the Soviet bloc. So see the kind of guests who've come in after that. So come down to 1965, you've seen the Pakistani come in. And 1964, by the way, was Mountbatten. 1961 was Queen Elizabeth, I told you, post-colonial / idealistic phase. Then 1966, no invitation. India was recovering from a lot of problems. There had been a war in 1965, 11 January 1966. Shastri had died. A new prime minister had to be elected. So there was a lot of uncertainty. Then you get into the Cold War phase. So 1968, there is Alexei Kosygin, the Soviet prime minister, and Tito at the same time. So Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia actually came into India twice as the chief guest. Then next year, 1969, Prime Minister of Bulgaria, Zhivkov, again from the Eastern Bloc. Then Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, 1973, Mobutu of Zaire. Then again 1974, Josip Broz Tito, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, 1975. These were all essentially Cold War anti-Western bloc, if not necessarily Warsaw Pact or Soviet bloc, but anti-Western figures. They became our chief guests. So this was the Cold War or Cold Warrior stage of Indian strategic evolution. And this carried on for as long as Cold War carried on. So if you see the Vietnamese leader, General Secretary Nguyen Van Linh, he came in 1989. There was President Alan Garcia of Peru in 1987, Andreas Papandreou of Greece in 1986, Shehu Shagari of Nigeria in 1983. This phase ended as the Cold War ended. And as the Cold War ended, India now stepped gingerly into the new world. Gingerly, they did step in the new world, but very carefully. So if you look at the Soviet Russian leaders, I mentioned to you earlier that India has had 4 of them. 3 of them came in while it was still the Soviet bloc. There was the president in the Soviet Union was like titular those days. There was, to begin with, in 1957, Minister of Defense, Marshal Zhukov, the legendary Marshal Zhukov. After that, in 1960, that is around time India is signing up to buy the first MiGs from the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union is still ambivalent between India and China, but India is making its first purchase. Those talks are going on. Those talks fructify by 1961. President Voroshilov of the Soviet Union is the chief guest in 1960. Then 1968, it's Kosygin. And then it takes 39 years after that. 39 years after that Putin comes in 2007, but it's no longer the Soviet Union. It is now Russia. Now, if you see this list, 1991 onwards, that is from the moment that Narasimha Rao became the Prime Minister of India, he took over power and he began to correct or reset India's foreign policy. Then you can see India walking in very carefully, very gingerly into the new world. So you had Singapore's Goh Tok Chong, John Major, 1993, not a British Labour leader, right? John Major. Of the right, you have Mario Suarez, of Portugal, a NATO member, President Mandela, of course, that you cannot put in any ideological straitjacket, then President Cardoso of Brazil, and then other people. But basically, what happens is that a lot of the third world leftist leaders or left-oriented leaders and icons now disappear from the list. There are many African leaders. There is Bouteflika from Algeria. There is President Obasanjo from Nigeria. So it's not as if Africans are not coming in. There is President Kassim Utim from Mauritius, but the emphasis shifts. And then you can see India come into the modern world in foreign policy terms. Modern world in the sense that when about a decade is over after the Cold War, India feels more confident engaging with the wider world. That's how the formulaic invitation lists now begin to change. So 2006, King of Saudi Arabia. It is the Manmohan Singh government that invited the King of Saudi Arabia because for a long time, India wasn't quite sure of its policy towards the Middle East. So there were some formulas. One that if you do anything with Israel, if you warm up to Israel, Muslims in India will get unhappy, and also the Islamic world will get unhappy. Also, there was a disinclination to acknowledge divisions within the Islamic world. And the divisions within the Islamic world are not just between Shias and Sunnis, not just between Iran and the Arab states or Shia Iran and Sunni Arab states. There are many other differences there also. There are differences, there are conflicts of interest because ultimately nationalism works. Now, Turkey and Qatar may be Sunni countries, but the fact is that their worldview is very different from that of Saudi Arabia or UAE or increasingly Egypt as well. But India was not playing that game. India just had a very straight-jacketed view of the Islamic world. Mainly, don't do anything that annoys India's Muslim voters. That was also underestimating India's Muslim voters and their commitment to nationalism, because to think that India's Muslim voters will be unhappy if any government of the day does something which is in national interest, but which may run contrary to the interest of some global pan-Islamic ideas, right? Say Palestine, for example, or friendship with America, Indo-US nuclear deal. Those were shibboleths of the past which were slowly being given up. So 2007, Vladimir Putin came in just after the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. And then among the important ones or the significant ones, Republic of Korea, not North Korea, Republic of South Korea as we might call it, Shinzo Abe from Japan, again a man of the nationalist right in Japan who became India's great friend and who completely reset Japan's policy towards India. In fact, its successors have carried that same policy forward. And then 2015, Barack Obama. Can you imagine an American president being the chief guest on India's Republic Day? And then 2017, again very important, that is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of UAE. So within 10 years, India had the ruler of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince of UAE as well. So that was also a phase of India's outreach to the Gulf Arabs at exactly the same time that India was warming up big time with Israel, and we've seen how that culminated into what is today called the I2U2 alliance, that is India, Israel, US, UAE. So this is how you can see India's foreign policy or strategic worldview go through a complete transformation. After that, 2018, we know, although we counted them as one guest, but the fact is this was the ASEAN 10. So 10 heads of state of ASEAN countries were invited. It was a brilliant idea. I have counted them as one guest because let's say this was the ASEAN heads of states group. Then there was Jair Bolsonaro, certainly not a man of the liberal left, although Lula had come as chief guest in 2004, so before the Manmohan Singh government had come in. Vajpayee government was still there. So he was the 2004 guest. Now came Bolsonaro, globally controversial as a man of the nationalist right, but he came in. Boris Johnson was invited. That got cancelled. And now you have Fattah El-Sisi. Now you see some interesting points there. In fact, if you see the last 8 guests, you will see how India's worldview has changed, how radically it has changed under Narendra Modi. So let's call it the Modi phase in India's strategic evolution. So 2014, this is obviously before Modi's come into power. He comes into power in summer. Republic Day happens in January. Shinzo Abe. After that, the first under Modi, Barack Obama. Then French President François Hollande, then UAE Crown Prince Sheikh Zayed, then Sultan of Brunei, then the ASEAN 10. You will see their names and the countries they lead on your screens. Then Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. South Africa will be a consistent pattern in Indian politics and Indian worldview. President Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson cancelled, and now Fattah El-Sisi. So all the guests under Narendra Modi tell you of the shift that's taken place, including the ASEAN 10 who came or who were invited together. So this, I thought, is a very good way of looking at how India's view of the world and India's sense of where it belongs in that world has evolved over these 7.5 decades. And I thought, just as we had looked at just a couple of days back, we had looked at those 21 Paramveer Chakra winners in our Cut the Clutter episode on Andaman and Nicobar Islands. We had looked at them to track the history of India's warfare in the last 75 years. This way, by looking at the chief guests on our Republic Day, we can check out the evolution, or we can mark the evolution of India's foreign policy from post-colonial, deeply idealistic, to left-wing cold warriors, to ambivalent and uncertain, to now unabashedly unhitched in the world, working pragmatically in our own interest without any ideology. Now, while we were setting this up, I told you France has had 5 guests, just as the British have had 5 guests. Now, you might say, oh, Britain, at least we had an old relationship, and that's why the first 15 years, so many Brit leaders came. How come we had so many from France? What's the big deal? So the French have always cultivated India and vice versa. The French have also been very solid, reliable partners for Indian defense forces. They've never sanctioned India because India has had to very carefully manage its global linkages. It was not part of the Cold War, but got drawn into the Cold War in at least for a decade, right? It did not want to be part of the Western Alliance, but is now closer to the Western Alliance. At the same time, India does not want to risk American sanctions on anything key, particularly to do with defense and sensitive technologies. So France has been a very reliable partner. And you know how much France's commitment has been to India, and how, if I may say so, how cynical, you can call it cynical, you can call it pragmatic, have the French been. That Jacques Chirac came as the chief guest to India on 26 January 1976, when it would be impossible for Mrs. Gandhi, that was the peak of the emergency, it would be impossible for her to get any Western leader, any leader from a Western democracy, particularly a big Western democracy, in this case a P5 power, to come to India as chief guest. So his presence in India on Republic Day 1976 was even seen as an endorsement by Mrs. Gandhi's emergency regime. Jacques Chirac, by the way, that's the reason I said in case of France, we count one guest twice, that is Jacques Chirac. Jacques Chirac came as Prime Minister in 1976 and later as President in 1998. So from France, we had Chirac in 76, Giscard in 1980, Chirac again as President in 98, Sarkozy in 2008, and then Hollande in 2016. So next time somebody tells you that the French seem to punch above their weight in India, correct them and remind them that no, it is just that the French have made more investment in India than any other Western power through these decades. So happy Republic Day, and on this note, please also tell me what did you think of this short, maybe 18-20 minute treatise on the evolution of India's strategic view, or India's view of the world and where it belongs in that world over these 75 years, simply by looking at our Republic Day guests.